This program is brought to you by Fresh FM.
Welcome to Before the Flood. I'm your host, Patrick Rose. You're listening to Fresh FM. We're broadcasting across the top of the South Island and around the world at freshfm.net. I've got a very important and very interesting show for you lined up this afternoon, so you don't want to go away. This is a show that would affect us all. This is about toxic sites here in New Zealand. The government's come out this week with a memorandum of understanding with the Green Party, teaming up with the Environment Minister, Mr. Nick Smith, Dr. Nick Smith, pointing out that we have over 20,000 contaminated sites here in New Zealand. Not only have they come up with this information, but they've come up with the information that many of them are at risk from earthquakes or floods or any one of the extreme weather events that we could be facing in the next few years. And so the government is sort of panicking and saying, well, what do we do to protect these sites and stop the toxic chemicals from getting off of the sites and getting onto other people's property and damaging our health, damaging our entire sort of environment here. So it's a very serious subject, and it's something that the government is really quite admittedly behind the eight ball on. They've not really invested a lot of time in this in this research, and they're sort of coming to this quite late in the game. For those of you who are familiar with the subject of contaminated sites and toxins, you might be familiar with what's happened in the United States, which, as we all know, is no leader in environmental affairs. But back in Jimmy Carter's final days in office, he pushed through what was called the Superfund, which was at least an attempt to grapple with 50 years of toxic chemical poisoning into our environment. And the United States at that point identified 100 toxic sites in the United States that they wanted to prioritize to clean up. Now, what happened was that of course, Jimmy Carter got voted out of office. Reagan came in and there was a huge sort of liberalization. This whole project was basically shelved and basically watered down into years and years of litigation and back and forth and who's responsible. And if I own a toxic site, but someone used it in the 60s and used DDT on it then, who's responsible then? And some of the companies have gone out of business. And so you can see that there's a lot of ambiguity and confusion as to, first of all, what are the toxins and who's responsible and who might help us pay for cleaning this up. Now, you might be surprised to learn, as I was, that New Zealand is only now, 30 years after the United States did it, beginning to compile such a list. This list, as they say, they estimate is about 20,000, but there could be many, many more sites than 20,000 because a lot of the toxins that were used here in New Zealand were used in very, very remote locations up in the middle of the forest. Logging companies were using dioxins and PCPs, and there's a whole number of different toxic sites that we simply just don't know about. For those of you who have followed this issue, you might be aware that the Tasman District Council has released a list very, very begrudgingly in 2009. The Nelson Mail has published that list. There are over 760 sites on that list within the Tasman District. Now, everything as minor as old gas stations where they used to do oil changes and, tip the stuff back into the creek, or things as serious as sheep dips, or things as serious as the Mapua DDT site. So we have the full range of spectrums here. I've tried to contact some of the people who are on this list, and unsurprisingly, people do not want to talk about the fact that their property is listed as one of these toxic sites. Now, of course, nothing is being done to tidy these sites up. The best strategy that the government has really come up with is the strategy of what they call pave and wave, where they say, well, if we just contain it, chuck a bunch of concrete down on top of this site, then we can open up a new shop on it and we're away. This is obviously not solving the problem. In fact, it's just kind of postponing it. And it's really only looking at that particular site, not the bleed off that happens, of course, every time it rains and you have oil into the soil or toxins in the ground. It's flowing into the creek and down the river and affecting all kinds of people within that food chain or the ecology there. So it's a very, very complicated issue, and there's no real legal structure here in New Zealand to really even begin to look at this. So it's even more complicated by the fact that we have a government that is actively going out and saying to international corporations, let's come in here and let's mine, let's start looking for natural gas, let's start exploring for oil, coal, we're open for business, I believe is some of the terms that's been used here. And as a matter of course, these corporations are coming with different chemicals that are going to be toxic to our environment. Any mining company is going to use lubrications for their drills. It's going to create sort of a toxic spill into the environment. Anyone who's done any research into natural gas exploration knows about the toxins within what's called fracking fluid, the fluid that they use to get down underneath the shale and sort of create these mini explosions underneath the soil. So unfortunately, this is not a problem of, oh, well, in the 60s we did some bad stuff and we've got to kind of clean it up at some point. This is a real problem that is, we did some bad stuff in the 60s and it's coming back to haunt us, but it's also happening right now. We continue to use all kinds of different toxins, and really the government is not really on the ball here in terms of trying to stop these toxins from being used and being, you know, implemented into our consumer chain or even into our agricultural or forestry chain. So I've got two really important guests with me today. The first one is Catherine Delahunty. She's a Green MP. She's totally on top of these issues, and she's the one who's at least got the Environment Minister come to the table here and to recognise that the Tui mine up in the Waikato is a very serious risk. If there is an earthquake there, we're looking at a huge toxic mess where all this stuff is going to flow downstream and poison thousands of people and potentially cause millions of dollars worth of damage. Her partner is named Gordon Jackman. He's an activist and a chemical researcher who's been instrumental in setting up things like the Forest Stewardship Council to create some sort of guidelines in the absence of any government leadership here, to create guidelines that are going to allow companies to sort of, you know, identify which chemicals should be used, which chemicals are going to create negative impact on the environment. So, as I say, this is a very, very topical and complicated issue. A lot of people would prefer not talking about this because it is such a complicated issue, and it opens up such a Pandora's box of who's responsible and who's going to pay for it. And one of the reasons why we're not sort of seeing any sort of clarity on this issue is because the government is really only looking at, if you talk to the Ministry of Health, they're really only looking at what the effects are of the people who live on those sites. So if people on that site are getting headaches and nosebleeds or different sort of responses to a potentially toxic, contaminated site, they're only looking at what's happening to the site. They don't have any sort of mapping system, this is according to the sources that I've spoken to. They don't have any mapping system that would determine what is the surrounding area, what is the impact on the children in the school next door or down the street, or the people who you know have lived nearby this toxic site. And of course it's extremely complicated. People move, people go to school for a little bit, people get leukemia, people get cancer, and then they move on, and they maybe they think it's something else. So there's a lot of ins and outs to this issue, and here today to join me to talk about this sort of subject is, as I say, the Green MP, Catherine Delahunty. And I started off by asking her, why is it that New Zealand has so many sites, and do they have more than other countries?
In agriculture and in the timber industry, in the plantation pine industry, we have created a lot of problems for ourselves, and we have been very slow to clean up sites which other countries have dealt with already. But we are one of the highest in terms of having old timber treatment sites. Other countries would also have contaminated gas works, leaking petrol station containers, chemical residues from food production. Many countries will have those types of problems. But New Zealand has got some major agricultural problems, but it's also got this nasty legacy of timber treatment sites. Old mine sites are a real problem around the world, like and the ones that have been created these days. So if you go to, say, the Appalachian Mountains of United States, they have real problems with their old mine sites, just as we do, and that's the focus of the Tui mine cleanup that I'm working on at the moment.
How much transparency has there been? You know, there is this list of 20,000 sites. Is the public allowed to see this?
There hasn't even really ever been a list. I mean, one of the things I've negotiated with the government in the last few months is that there would be a national register of the worst orphan sites, the ones that no one takes responsibility for. There has been a regional council list which has been developed since, I think myself and Gordon, when we first toured the country with this issue for Greenpeace in 1993, some regional councils had set up lists then, but there's been a huge lack of transparency, both nationally and regionally, which is why I raised the issues in Parliament about a national register. And although we're not going to have one huge national register, what we will have is a list of priority sites nationally which are publicly accessible, so everyone knows which ones are the worst in the country that government are going to commit to clean up over time. And we will also have the regional councils having a standardised software program that's going to have coherent reporting and be accessible to everybody, because that is one of the key goals, is that it's public knowledge. People just don't know where these sites are or how to understand the data of this very complex issue. So one of our goals with the regional registers is to get the standard software negotiated in the next year or so that there is some consistent reporting that everybody can understand.
I have a copy of the regional register for Tasman here, and some of the people that I've spoken to who actually own properties that are on that register, they do not want to make a big deal about it or talk about any of the liability or any of the issues associated with it, because they might be wanting to sell the property at some point. And for right now, it's such a sort of quiet list that that nobody really seems to know about it. How do we deal with with that issue, that people aren't going to want to know that their property is potentially contaminated?
Well, indeed, you've nailed one of the central issues, which is that we would rather live in denial because of property values, even though we're prepared to risk our health and other people's. And I think that's the difficulty with issues around toxic chemicals, is because they're so invisible, people can pretend they're not having an impact and don't want to be associated with their property being named. But we have a responsibility as a community to clean up toxic sites, and we can't do that if we're not naming them. And of course, they're not all of the same seriousness. There will be sites in the Tasman district which are maybe a small area of contamination of a sheep dip, for example, which can be highly toxic because they used chemicals like dieldrin and DDT in the old days. So it may be a very limited area on a property, right through to the Mapua site, which of course has been one of the most disastrous sites in the whole country. So that's the problem with not having clear reporting, is that, let alone the issue of liability, which we really need to work through in this country, so that people don't feel liable for things they did not create. At the moment, the polluter pays doesn't exist, and what we have is current owner is responsible for cleanup. And no wonder people don't want to take on that burden, because they didn't create the problem, and it's not fair. And I have an agreement with the Minister that we will work through that issue as well in terms of possible changes to the law. And
now, America has many faults in terms of its environmental sort of policies and so on, but in 1979, 1980, they set up the Superfund to try to sort of work through the worst kind of lists. Now, I mean, there's been all kinds of disasters in terms of trying to figure out who's liable. It's been a real litigation festival instead of actually cleaning things up so much. But doesn't it seem a bit, we're 30 years on from that, 40 years on from that. How come New Zealand's so late to the game in even identifying the list, let alone cleaning these sites up?
Because of corporate resistance. There's been a huge corporate investment in not taking responsibility, both in forestry industry and in the horticultural producers of chemicals. And every single site that I have worked on, and I've only been involved in this for 15 years, and Gordon a lot longer, there has been denial, there has been a failure of accountability by the companies, there has been a failure of responsibility by government, and it has cost lives. When you look at the sawmill workers in Whakatane, who are my colleagues doing a fabulous job of standing up for their rights as poisoned workers, the progress has been entirely due to their absolute commitment to finding a solution and to challenging local, regional health authorities, environmental authorities and government to do better. And in the discussions with the Minister, I would like to have seen a levy of some nature, but from the industry, to take the main industries associated with the contamination to something like a super fund. But this government is not going to wear that. The best that we could get was to try and get a change to the issue of liability and shift towards polluter pays. And I agree with you. It's absolutely appalling how long it's taken, and when I first became involved in this issue, it was like my eyes were opened. I suddenly saw my country, so-called clean and green, through whole new eyes. And I did a tour of the country with Gordon, visiting areas, regional areas where I met people affected, people who had been struggling to deal with the issue of a contaminated site, and a level of denial in the regional authorities which reflects the level of chemical ignorance as well as the vested interest that has dogged this issue from the beginning.
Now, the national government that's in power now seems to have a general policy of saying, well, like with the waterways, let's just hand it over to the regional councils. We'll create some sort of loose guidelines, but really it's up to the councils to kind of interpret that as they want. Are we going to see the same sort of scenario happening here, where they're going to continue to delegate this, and then ultimately the councils get to water it down because they don't want to step on the toes of their cash cow, the big logging companies, the mining companies in their region?
I think that as in the United States, we can improve the framework, but we still need the political will. And I think that what we have negotiated with government is an improvement if we can get at least honest reporting, standardised reporting, and stronger direction to local authorities. If we can at least get a standard set. Now, the other thing that we are working on with the Memorandum of Understanding is getting an independent peer review of the national environmental standards, because at the moment standards for clean-up of contaminated sites are purely set around human health on the actual site itself, and that's not going to deal with the issues because, of course, chemicals move, they migrate, and we need an environmental standard that looks at the food chain as well as something that just looks at human health. I mean, this issue has huge, complex struggles ahead of us, and I've got no illusions that we've solved the problem. But I think that we are starting at least to get a negotiation going with this particular minister who has actually taken an interest in this. The last government took no interest in it, to be honest, and we fought really hard to try and get them to do anything. Neither Labour nor National can hold their heads up in the past over dealing with this issue. But Nick Smith did try in the 1990s to get the liability issue changed. Him and Simon Upton did some work on some ideas for changing the law, and that didn't happen, unfortunately, but when the government changed. But I think there is a genuine interest there, at least on his part, and that's what we're trying to work with. Because this is not going to be solved overnight, but we have to start setting modern, realistic, environmental as well as health standards. So we've got as far as agreeing to have a peer review. The Ministry for the Environment doesn't want an environmental standard for toxic sites. They just want a human health one. And what that means for the listener who's probably really confused by now is paving over, concreting over, literally over some of these sites so that people can walk around or build supermarkets or whatever on top of them. But what we want is a proper look at the environment and a proper standard that recognises modern understanding of how small amounts of chemicals can affect the food chain. And so we're in negotiation over that, but we have an agreement with the Minister that we'll get an independent person that we agree to peer review the Ministry's opinion, because we think the Ministry's opinion is completely unsatisfactory. They're saying it's too difficult to do it. Actually, that's bollocks, because other countries do it. United States, Canada, many other countries who have toxic sites have an environmental standard as well as a health standard. So this sounds really obscure, but it's probably the most important thing that we got out of the memorandum that we negotiated with the Minister last week. Probably this environmental standard in the long run, if we can get it set, if we can get it through and get it set, will actually force clean up to a proper level. But I'm under no illusions that landowners and local authorities, etc., will embrace this with enthusiasm. And also, government have said that they will only take on responsibility for so much, and part of that's financial. It's huge amounts of money to clean up toxic sites, and as you know from Nelson, Mapua cost far more than was predicated, and also was done wrong. Yeah. And actually was, created some problems of its own. And of course, some of the people in Mapua get very angry when I say this. Some other people who in the Tasman District Council get very angry because they did deal with some of the contamination, but they still have problems in the estuary. And that's a good example of an off-site effect, which is why we need an environment standard, not just a human health one.
Well, how genuine is the minister really if he's making these noises saying we got to clean up these sites, but at the same time the same government is actively courting different mining contracts, deep sea drilling, natural gas exploration, and as we all know, deep sea drilling, there's a whole number of different toxic chemicals that need to be involved in the lubrication of the drills and so on. If we look at natural gas exploration, the fracking fluid that we've talked about on this program. So, as you say, there's still contracts that are being given out, and that our standards of which chemicals get used is not quite up to scratch. And so, how genuine is the minister really if he's saying we want to clean things up, but the same government is handing out contracts left and right?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question that you should put to him. Because I live in the Coromandel and I see what mining does. But I do see that the ability that we had last week to negotiate a deal with this minister was the first time in a long time that we actually got anybody in any government to take any interest in the serious issue. So for me, I give him as a minister credit for being willing to engage with us and take this issue seriously. It's not... there are not many people that will. At the same time, I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge that as a government, their commitment to clean and green is being daily, it must be daily questioned in terms of mining and drilling. I mean, mining and drilling issues, 2 weeks ago I was on a protest on a drilling site in the Coromandel, and I was thrilled to hear on the news the other day that you guys had given Grey Wolf a bit of a fight and that they won't get their permits. So, we are in a battle zone around the next generation of contamination, which is we want to stop deep sea oil drilling. We want to stop mining of coal and gold because of the damage that they do to the environment, because that has the potential to create a 21st century series of contaminated sites. However, I'm not going to deny the progress, because we've been working on this for a long time, and the deal we made last week, if we can make it live, I think the minister's genuine. The struggle I'm going to have is with the Ministry for the Environment, because they have not been leaders in this issue. They have been very, very, and it's difficult because they are guided by governments, but really, when the Ministry for the Environment cannot even see the need for an environmental standard, that is very contradictory.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, some of the motivation here might be the fact that we've had some major earthquakes in the last 6 months, and that can, as you're looking at in the Tui mine there, can create a huge amount of liability and exposure and so on. How much beyond the sort of magnitude of an earthquake, but what about just things like runoff or intense storms or heavy floods and so on? How much of these sites, these 20,000 sites, are potential sort of spreaders that could get beyond the borders where they already are sort of reasonably contained?
Well, a lot of them aren't contained because they haven't been properly identified and isolated. You do get, there are places like Tui, which is, I think you're absolutely accurate. The real risk is not an earthquake so much as a weather bomb. We have those regularly up on the Coromandel, and I was here in the 1980s when some people were killed as a result of debris coming off the Mount Te Aroha, not from the tailings dam, from another valley, but it killed some people. So, I know that this place, we have these things regularly, and I think that with climate change, we're going to have more around the country. So any site that's in a vulnerable environment in terms of the weather or the earthquakes is a concern. The Cypress Gold Mine, the abandoned site at Waikino in the Coromandel, much greater, more modern tailings dam, was built on a kind of underground earth fault, not an earthquake fault, but just a kind of underground slip. So, that could be a problem in future. I think that we've got those big sites, but in terms of a lot of the sites, we don't really know where they are and what their boundaries are, because the work hasn't been done. And, it is frightening to say so, but a lot of the timber treatment stuff was done at mobile mills in the forest, so that they've created pockets of contamination that have yet to be identified. And dioxin, PCP, contaminated dioxin, has a half-life of 25 years. We're out of PCP now, and no one uses it, but but we still haven't identified all the sites, let alone the stages that we've been talking about for years, which is identify, isolate, and then find safe cleanup. Do not do anything to a site unless you can find a safe cleanup methodology, which is hard to find. And Mapua is a good case study of a highly experimental, dubious process. What they're working on in Whakatane, the tangata whenua are working with scientists. The sawmill workers are working together with Māori and with Pākehā scientists from Waikato University on a fungi that could eat up the contamination for the 26 at least sites that they know of around Whakatane that are not, they're connected to a canal, they're associated with water, they're associated with soils that can move. So it's not like these things are neat and tidy and we just have to find a way of fixing them. They ain't neat, they ain't tidy, and we've got a lot of work to do. But at least it's good to have got to the stage in Whakatane where they are working at a non-expensive, natural way of trying to work on the cleanup of some of these really horrible chemicals.
Can you just give us a bit of the backstory? What happened in 1991 that changed the sort of the liability structure here in terms of these toxic sites?
The RMA came in, and so what happens now is we've got current ownership. Current owners are liable, but basically, and the RMA means that on all, and I'm not sure if it was under the RMA or whether it was under another act, but all sites are now recorded, the ones that are known, are recorded on a LIMS report. So when you buy a property, a house or a piece of land, you can go and look at for, I think it's $200, which could be a barrier for some people, but you can get a LIMS report on previous uses of the land. And so people now have the ability to look at what they're buying and go, oh, okay. I mean, for example, my daughter was just looking at a house in Auckland, and it said on the LIMS report that there was a former dump, landfill just up the road, and there was potential contamination. And that then she could make a judgment call about whether she wanted to live there or not, or how close it was. And that wasn't even on the land, that was just associated up the road, but it was on the LIMS report. So that issue of people having better information if they're going to buy a property, through the LIMS system, people do actually have that information now, and that came in since 1991. But the pre-1991 sites, we only stopped using PCP in 1989. So, those sites are still, many of them still to be addressed. And a lot of them are what they call orphan sites because the companies have gone bankrupt. And we don't have a structure here, which I think some other countries have adopted, where individuals from corporates can be made liable. So what we've got now is, all you have to do, and this is what happened at Tui, is that you just have to say, well, we're bankrupt, and then you lose liability, and then it becomes the liability of the Crown. And that's why we're trying to work on trying to advance that liability issue through the law and make the polluters that can be identified pay. And I mean, it's going to be a struggle because the forestry industry, I mean, in many ways, the levy is more attractive because you don't go through that, that litigation process of trying to chase and pin down and attribute a responsibility. But since we're not going to get a levy this time round, it's better than nothing to start trying to clean up the issue of polluter pays historically.
Now, I know that the government is struggling with financial crisis and budget shortfalls and so on, but is there even talk about putting aside, I daren't use the word superfund, but some funds in order to sort of, underwrite this stuff so that we can sort out the worst cases?
Yeah. There's talk of government taking responsibility for perhaps up to 20 of the worst sites. And I think there'll be interesting discussion about what those are because there's some sites associated with the pulp mills, for example, at Kinleith and Kawiro, which Gordon, my partner, and I have, particularly Gordon, has done a lot of work on, and, I have visited these places, and they're huge, very, very large sites. So the Waipa sawmill, my partner was recently on Native Affairs on a program about contamination from a site near Waipa sawmill in Rotorua that was affecting the penny divers from Rotorua, the kids who dive for money in the Pueringa stream at Whakarewa for the tourists, which is a sort of cultural habit. They've been doing it for a long time, but that stream is contaminated. So there's no talk of a sort of super fund to fix the overall problem, but there is the minister did say that they thought there would be, the top, there would be a possibility of identifying the top 20 and making another budget bid, depending on who's the government, obviously, making another budget bid for 2012, if they're still the government, to try and get more money into a fund for those orphan sites. We really do have to start somewhere.
Yeah. And what would you say? Let's say there's someone out there who's suffering with a variety of symptoms, and they don't know exactly what would be some of the symptoms that might be associated with some of the worst sites or some of the worst sort of contaminated sites. How would people know that they maybe what they have is not related to their own sort of weakness, but it actually is something from a contaminated site?
I think that really depends on what the contaminated site is. So heavy metals, being exposed to heavy metals from a mine site in a water supply is quite different from timber treatment, being exposed to dust, say, from a timber treatment site. But take, for example, people of Minganui contacted us recently. Minganui's up in the Urewera National Park. It's a very isolated and very poor community. They have discovered they've got a site which is being cleaned up, but not necessarily to the standard that they want. But half of them don't even know what that is, and that site has, kids have been playing on it and all the rest of it. What you'd look for with an old timber treatment site would be quite diverse effects, and that's what makes it so difficult. So some people get what they call chloracne, which is when your skin breaks out into a terrible rash and it doesn't go away, and that's because your body's excreting the chemical at least to the skin surface, and it's manifesting a reaction to being exposed to a chlorinated chemical. Other people would not necessarily, they might just get really major problems with immunity, the immune system, and just start catching things, and that's where it gets really difficult to identify what has actually caused that. I do get lots of emails from people around the country who think they might have been exposed to chemicals, and it's so difficult to prove because it's not something you can just do a simple blood test for. So it's often in the fat cells, and that's, where the SORMA workers had to go through a lot to get their condition recognised because of the diversity of effects. So some people were getting cancer, some people were getting incredible headaches, some people were getting bone growth disorders, some people were having, one of the most tragic things we saw when we toured in 93 was reproductive disorders, birth defects, children born with holes in their hearts. Because this is intergenerational, some of the timber treatment dioxin-related stuff is intergenerational, so it's not just the person, it's the person who washed their clothes at home and their children and sometimes grandchildren, and the Vietnam vets will tell a similar story. So you get diabetes, cancer, heart disease. So it's really quite heavy duty and really, really hard to pin down.
Yeah. Do you think that the companies that manufacture these chemicals and use these chemicals, do they sort of hide behind the fact that it is so hard to pin down, and they sort of bank on not just the ambiguity of liability, but the ambiguity of the health effects as well?
Oh, absolutely. And Monsanto is one of the world's classics for this. They were involved with producing with the factory in New Plymouth, and what the people around New Plymouth have been through, are being told that there's nothing wrong with them, and that it's psychological, or it's caused by something else, or it's a genetic tendency to cancer or whatever. It's really, really tough for people who've been exposed to prove anything. And the studies, I've been trying to help the people there with trying to get some independent peer review of some of the birth defect studies, because scientists are, as you know, are not neutral. Scientists bring whoever's paying them to the table. That's how they get paid these days, is on contract. And so if you're working for the Ministry of Health or you're working for a company, you're going to find, your bias is going to be set by what they are, the terms of reference that they've asked you to look at. And to get an independent voice on issues of chemical contamination, is extremely difficult. And like with Mapua, we've been trying to support some of the workers who were who were brave enough to say that they became very sick after working in the cleanup. And it's incredibly hard for them to prove that. And it's incredibly unpopular around Nelson to say, I got sick in the cleanup. I mean, because people have a huge investment in that issue being finished. And, would to God it was. I know that the site's a lot safer where they've actually covered it, but the off-site effects and what those people went through and what happened through the, what came out of the stacks on the cleanup, mechanical cleanup process, how will those people prove that it's made them sick? I mean, these are huge problems, and that's why I guess as an environmentalist I believe in the precautionary approach and say, well, to the companies, you prove it's safe before you use our bodies as a testing ground or a dumping ground for your chemicals. And if they had to prove everything was safe, that would be a really different world.
That was Catherine Delahunty joining us from her home in the Coromandel. She's a Green MP who specialises in this sort of issue, in the issue of contaminated sites and mines and cleanup and so on. And if you were just joining us halfway, you might have thought she was talking about somewhere in like Vietnam where they were struggling with birth defects from Agent Orange or some other sort of toxic chemicals leached into the third world or something. But no, that was actually her experiences traveling around New Zealand, talking to people who live near or on these contaminated sites, talking to people who work or worked on these contaminated sites and who have become extremely ill. And as she said, it's intergenerational. So some people are being born now with holes in their hearts and all kinds of different, horrible things that have happened to them, all because people were working in an industry where, at the time the government said, sure, it's safe, go ahead and you can use PCPs and you can use, DDT and you can do sheep dip in this and you can sort of, have these mobile sort of timber mills up in the bush. And of course, what's happened now is that we're starting to see the legacy, and we're going to continue to live with this legacy for the next 40, 50 years as all these sort of toxic chemicals get into not just our food system, but into our children and into our entire lives. And it's absolutely staggering that we're just here right now in 2011 and the Green Party is the only person who's really talking about this. They're pathetically grateful that the minister has even thrown them a bone that said, okay, well, let's clean up a couple sites, and we don't want to talk about how much we might spend or how many we'll clean up, but let's at least look at maybe trying to identify 20 sites. But there are 20,000 contaminated sites. There are over 700 here in Tasman. All you have to do is Google contaminated sites, Tasman District Council. It'll come up. The Nelson Mail has done the hard work for us. That sunk without a stone. Nobody wants to talk about this issue. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that we are living on contaminated sites, living near contaminated sites, and that this issue is all about maintaining the property values, and nobody wants to rock the boat here too much. But we basically have a massive hole in our political system. Labour doesn't want to rock the boat because we're looking at all the different sort of, blue-collar employers of the mines, the forestry industry, and so on, and agriculture. And National sure doesn't want to rock the boat because we've got all the big multinationals like Monsanto and all the big agricultural companies that are pumping these chemicals into our systems. So you've got this huge political hole that these companies are driving this truck right through, and unless we wake up, people, and start putting pressure on not just the politicians, but somewhere putting pressure on the media to start covering these issues, we're going to continue to get more toxic sites and continue to get sicker and sicker and sicker. So my next guest is Catherine Delahunty's partner. He's a very courageous campaigner. He's been dealing with this issue for over 30 years. His name is Gordon Jackman. He's an activist and a chemical researcher since 1981. He was instrumental in setting up the Forest Stewardship Council, which at least creates some guidelines in the absence of government leadership on this issue. I spoke to him and I said, look, how many sites actually are there, and is 20,000 accurate? He said there's actually way more than 20,000.
Because of our heavy reliance.
Just in the forestry industry, there were lots of minor sites all over the place. So there'd be many thousand as a response to that. And then you get sheep dips and petrol stations and other things. Nobody really knows. The councils themselves, and I think you're familiar with some of those lists, probably have, 15 or so thousand sites listed right throughout the country. No one's counted them yet. And undoubtedly, that is not all the sites.
Wow. I mean, but what happens to, individual, let's say there's a small gas station and they're just like a family-run thing and suddenly they get listed as a toxic site. What happens to them? How much liability are they going to have? They're barely making ends meet as it is. What happens to the fact that maybe there was toxins poured into the creek behind their station, 20, 30 years ago?
Well, this is a gaping hole in the RMA. Catherine would have referred to that earlier. We do not have any laws that sheet down the liability, as opposed to, for instance, Australia or New South Wales in particular, which has a whole regime which you need to go through that then establishes liability. And even if a company has gone broke, a shareholder or a company director who knowledgeably did that is held liable. And then there's a whole series of paths that you go through to eventually, if it is a totally orphaned site, it becomes the responsibility of the state. At the moment, any site that's been contaminated after 1991 is the landowner is liable for that under the RMA. Before that, they're still liable for that, and that's the problem.
What's happening in different European countries or in the United States, for instance, where there's actually been some success in trying to turn back this tide of not just creating a trail of liability, but actually implementing some reduction in that toxicity on the contaminated site?
Soil guideline values, they differ from every country, and there's actually different regimes in every country. And all of them, I think, are still behind the eight ball. And some areas, you have lawyers taking up a large amount of the money that would be better off remediating sites. You also sometimes have a really expensive remediation, which it doesn't work very well. I always think that with sites, there's a sort of priority or hierarchy you have to deal with it. And the first is identification, and the second is isolation. And only then, if that doesn't work, do you get into remediation. Because remediation has dangers in terms of either on-site impacts or creating another toxic site somewhere else by just moving it.
Yeah.
So, the whole world is struggling with these legacies.
Is there any country like Sweden or something where you think, gosh, they're they have really good standards and they're really quite efficient at cleaning it up or something? I'm just wondering if there's any example of a model kind of that New Zealand could set quite a high standard and say, okay, we're not there, but in 5-10 years we could really get our regulatory and our liability structure set up to resemble this country. Well,
yes. I mean, the European model is what we actually think is the best one, and we would like IRMA, or what would be the EPA, to start reassessing chemicals more as Europeans do, which are higher standards but also a more precautionary approach. At the moment, our sort of legislation basically says there is a safe limit, and you prove us, show us bodies on the ground before we'll change that. Whereas the European one tends to say, well, if there's reasonable scientific evidence, let's err on the side of caution. It doesn't mean to say you're sort of totally mad on that, but it's where there is reasonable scientific inference, even though there isn't 100% proof. So that's the first thing, is to change the regulatory model, which is a more precautionary approach rather than a permissive one. And then I think what they are superior to us is the funding, because at the moment, the standards, if you might have good standards, if you haven't got any funding, then nothing happens. And in this country, at the moment, we've only got about $1.2 million a year allocated to our contaminated site fund. And that is ridiculously small, considering, one site can eke up millions. So without the funding, everything else is toothless. And in that respect, we are way behind our equivalents in the OECD.
Is the ultimate goal to do what you've done with the Forest Stewardship Council, where you kind of create a more transparent guideline where you designate what sort of chemicals are toxic, and then create in the absence of a sort of government leadership here, you work within certain industries?
Yes, I think that needs to go across, the farming and the manufacturing industry. What FSC approach is, we've got a list of chemicals which are acceptable, and we fight over those. and everything else isn't, rather than listing everything that's dangerous, because you'd never do that. So it's more like saying which are the acceptable ones, and even those ones, which do we need to look at phasing out after a few years. It's like anything, there's a range of different fronts, you might say, we need to work on in order to get a solution.
And so if someone is just listening to this in their home, what kind of steps could they take to reduce the exposure of their family and their children to different toxic chemicals that the government says they're safe and that they've been allowed into the country, but there might be a whole series of different hidden additives into that particular compound that might be breaking down and creating different potential health risks?
The best things I can do is recommend a website called EWG, the Environmental Working Group, which is an American website, and it really has the best information I know on what chemicals to avoid and what to buy instead of that. And it's an amazing website, and it's got very simple and easy to understand languages about the sort of things to avoid in the home, what cleaners, what perfumes, cosmetics, flooring. I mean, going back to PVC, it's been found, for instance, that houses with PVC flooring covers, vinyl covers, there is a definite relationship between that and the prevalence of autism. Now, a while ago there was a scare about vaccines, which has been proved to be false over autism, but here's the actual, the scientific evidence is to show it there. And yet, for some reason, we don't get the world up in arms about PVC in our houses, and I think we should be. So that's one of the first things I'd avoid, gutterings and PVC. It's just a toxic chemical. It's called the poison plastic. And, that'd be the first thing you want to get rid of in the house.
Yeah. Now, since you've been involved in this issue, very intensively since the early 80s, obviously there have been some successes in designating things as dangerous and reducing some of the toxic exposure, like the CPC you mentioned at the beginning. But at the same time, there's also been a huge explosion in the amount of chemicals that are out there, and the amount of chemicals that people are using in their homes, the amount of chemicals that corporations are using in products that we buy. Do you ever get sort of overwhelmed or dispirited by how quickly these chemicals are proliferating into our lives?
Logically, one would be very depressed about it, but I'm an irrational optimist. In the sense that I know there are lots of wonderful people around the world working on these issues. And rather than a piecemeal approach to each chemical, and we have had some victories in terms of each chemical, but really we need a change now in approach, not just a chemical by chemical thing, which is why we need what was IRMA and now EPA has to adopt a precautionary approach to chemicals. And that movement is growing quite considerably around the world, and the States especially it's growing, so that, for instance, San Francisco as a city has adopted that approach to all its buying of supplies, and that means it traces the sort of lifestyle analysis back with each thing they buy, and if it's, they look at which is the least harmful solution. And so when you get that sort of powerful purchasing, and you get whole institutions adopting it, then real change, I think, is beginning to happen. So no, I'm pretty sad about how much we've put out there and the misery it caused. But one can't give up on trying to get a better outcome now. And I think we're helped in a way by the net and by our increased scientific ability to look at these things, and more evidence is coming out, and I think that will eventually turn the tide, I'm hoping.
You'd mentioned that your frustration that the part of the problem is the regulatory body is still too permissive in allowing different chemicals to be used. And as we look ahead at some of the economic hole that New Zealand is in, and the current government's solution, which is let's get a whole bunch of mining and drilling companies in here and get us out of this problem. These companies are going to be coming with, as a matter of course, toxic chemicals to run their machines. There's no alternative to fracking fluid that's going to be environmentally friendly. How do we court these companies, get them to come to the table, and then all of a sudden say to them, you know what, all the things that you use elsewhere, you can't use here?
I guess if I was in government, I wouldn't allow them in the first place, because most of the activities are totally useless, really, in the long term. That's the problem we have of a government that does this myth about balancing the economy and the environment. They always say, you've got to balance, but actually it's like trying to balance a hydrogen balloon and a bunch of lead, you just can't do it. The thing is, it's not an either or, you have to have both. You can't excuse poisoning the planet for a little bit of profit. We actually have to have consistent, sustainable, and well-founded regulations on everything we do. The unintended consequences, it's like, humans like to get the goodies, so they never want to pay for the baddies, which inevitably arise later on. So we have at the moment an inadequate system, as I said, for regulating these things, even an adequate political system, because the fact is that we have a population that is largely chemically ignorant, and I think mainly due to the way chemistry is taught in schools, appallingly. A company that is, government that is driven by economic growth, and economic growth requires converting natural resources into wealth. And, they're never going to balance properly poisoning the future when you can't at the moment prove this will cause that disease. And that's the problem is, if you can put out even the worst carcinogen and you can say, you did something else, it's that direct proving that they put up as a barrier. And that's a permissive approach. And as I said, we need the precautionary approach, which says where it's likely to do damage, don't do it. But so it's a whole mind shift that needs to go.
I agree with you 100% that it needs to happen. The question is how quickly it happens, because it's clear that this government is willing to sort of turn a blind eye to whatever sort of potential toxic effects might be happening from deep sea drilling. I mean, even the concerns of local iwi have been largely ignored up on the East Cape. So the government has really shown that it's prioritizing resource exploration, and
that's right.
that is going to. Do you see that as having a profound toxic impact, or is this just a drop in the ocean, literally?
I think it has the potential to have quite a profound toxic impact, depending on in certain localities, and some of those things are sort of ubiquitous. You can get everywhere. I guess that's why, with this MOU that the Greens have signed, we are starting to open a crack in the door. I'm not saying that we're open or we've got through it, but we have to open a crack in this whole process. And at the moment, with contaminated sites, there are no environmental standards in this country, only standards to protect the health of people on the site. So you can put a great big concrete slab over a highly contaminated site and say, welcome in, what they call pave and wave, and yet that doesn't protect the environment off-site or people who may be exposed off-site at all. So even getting that would be a major change, and I think if a number of industries knew about that, and they may well do in time, that they're going to find their opposition comes in. So I don't hold out much hope for this particular government to change. I guess that's why we need to work for broader political change.
That was Gordon Jackman joining us by telephone from the Coromandel. He and Catherine Delahunty have been behind the memorandum of understanding with the Minister and Dr. Nick Smith about cleaning up some of the 20,000 toxic sites here in New Zealand. This has been a presentation of Before the Flood. You've been listening to Fresh FM.
Thanks to New Zealand On Air for making this program available through funding the Access Internet Radio Project.